Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Wolf, and I'm the Director of Exhibitions here at the Dairy Barn Arts Center. Today, we are doing an artist talk with Susan and Judith, two artists showcasing their work in the Layered and Stitched 50 Years of Innovative Art exhibition, which is on view now at the Dairy Barn Arts Center. This exhibition was produced by Studio Arts Quill Associates and is open May 28th through September 4th, 2022. For more information about the show, you can check us out at dairybarn.org. And now I'm going to have Suzanne start by introducing herself.
Okay, hi, I'm Susan Else. I'm located in Santa Cruz, California, and I make three-dimensional quilted, collaged and quilted cloth sculpture.
And hi, I'm Judith Content, and I'm joining you from Palo Alto, California, just across the hills from Susan. And you are in my studio, which began its life as a two-car garage, and then the neighborhood preschool, and now my makerspace. Thank you.
Great. So now I'm going to turn it over to you two. I'm going to turn my video off and mute myself. And then if you need me to come back in, just let me know.
Okay, we'll yell. So I think I'm supposed to start this off, Judith. You know, I'm assuming that the viewers will get a chance to see our work that's in the show before we actually start talking. So my first question is, what processes were used in making your piece, Lavriere, for Layered and Stitched?
Oh, thanks, Susan. That's a great question. I have been fascinated by the Japanese process of arashi shibori since 1979, when I discovered it in college. And it was a light bulb moment of this process that could create the most exquisite patterns and incorporate the most beautiful colors. And originally I did my dyeing on tiny little broom handles and mop handles. And so the results were also small. And I think that's one reason I was drawn to quilting, because what else are you going to do with a lot of tiny pieces of fabric but to sew them together? And then I discovered wine bottles. So I used that as a form for my dyeing. And then I broke one too many by dropping it on the cement floor. So I moved to ABS plastic pipe, and I do intricate wrapping, intricate pleating, wrapping, dyeing, over dyeing, discharging, and layer the colors. And then when they're done, I unfurl them and they all become part of my collage, my materials for collage. And just as an aside, I brought a pole so you can see what it looks like before it's unwrapped. So it's dense layers underneath and surface color on the top. And this is the pipe. So thank you. And I guess I will ask the next question. And
we'll get the hang of this eventually.
We will. We're good friends, so we have a lot of patience. And Susan, what are you currently creating?
Well, it's kind of an offshoot of the piece that's in Layered and Stitched, which is a family grouping of three skeletons. It's kind of a tender moment, but the people are all obviously dead because they're skeletons. They're covered with a festive cloth surface, but also incorporated with that cloth surface is text about the challenges faced by families in today's world. So the work with the skeletons has to do with this idea that the world is a big ball of wax, and in the midst of doing very mundane things or having a tender moment, we always have the possibility and need to address the possibility that there's mortality in our lives as well. So the skeletons were a way for me to kind of make that point. Here are all these people doing all this normal stuff, and I did a series of 5 of them.
Really?
And yet, Yeah,
I
and
didn't know
yet,
that.
and they're gestural and tender or banal or whatever it is,
Oh, they're so
and
warm.
yet
They look
they
like they're,
they're
they,
warm and tender and obviously remind us that death is something that we have
mhm,
to learn to live with.
yeah.
So a couple of years ago, sort of beginning of the pandemic or the year before, I had on the idea that what I'd like to do is to create a series of domestic objects. So you can see behind me, there's a dresser with a mirror, and then there's
Mhm.
a little bed, and back there is a rocking chair, and it has a little baby blanket over the shoulder, but they're all made of, they have plastic bones as part of their armature. And plastic bones are what is used in the piece that's in layered and stitched as well. It's all Halloween store stuff. And then I make a collaged and quilted surface that goes over the top of those and is sewn down really tight. So this series is, I think it has about 7 pieces in it now, different kinds of objects of daily use.
Mhm.
And so in doing this series, I've been thinking about ancestors and people who used things that are handed down, often in families, and also what else gets handed down in families. Is it, the ethos of the family, or is there some problem or some really creative way of dealing with challenges? All those things are part of how we acquire those as we're raised. And sometimes it's to be surmounted, and sometimes it's something to be welcomed. But these pieces are sort of a symbol of how we live every day with
Mhm.
elements of our past and our ancestors. So,
Susan, when you're working on a piece, do you find your mind wandering to the next piece and it brings up ideas that you feel that you need to I address in another piece, or you are, so you're not just
oh yeah,
fully
it's,
immersed,
I
right?
always say that work engenders work. If I
Ah,
don't ever enter the studio, I'm not gonna be inspired to do anything. It's really a continuum. And,
right.
a lot of the work is really different. Some of it's just, figurative without being a skeleton. Here's a little reader reading her
Uh-huh.
iPad. But so there's regular figurative work as well. But
Right,
the skeleton, these 2 series, the gestural skeleton figures and the domestic objects made of bones, really are an outgrowth of each other, and they're a way of talking about related issues, but different
right,
ones.
right. Oh, that's
So
fascinating.
anyway, I have a question for you. Can you tell us about the title of the piece that's in Layered and Stitched?
I that's a good question too. I like it. Well, a lot of my work it has been inspired by estuaries, the intertidal zone, that sweet spot between high tide and low tide, and the just the vibrant ecosystem that exists there. So not too many years ago, I started to actually travel the world to see different ecosystems in the various estuaries. And I found my favorite one, this rich, amazing hidden treasure at the base of the Loire River in Brittany, where the Loire River exits into the Atlantic. And the ecosystem there is like 700 hectares, and it's vast. It's a wetlands that has been preserved mostly due to its isolation. And then during the 1970s, when appreciation for the ecosystem and the value of coastal waterways and coastal ecosystems was recognized across the world, it became preserved, and it became Lavriere Parc Naturel. And Lavriere is the title and the name of the park. And so I just simply titled that piece after that location. And it was interesting because the piece, when you see an image of it, it has a center area which looks like reeds and grasses. And that didn't exist before I went to Lavriere. And so it's a piece that I didn't think was in process. I thought it was finished, but after I came home from Lavriere, I knew that that piece needed more. And that's because of the flora that grows in Lavriere are these enormous, tall reeds and grasses and rushes. And essentially they create vast canalways and waterways. The only way to get across the marsh is by boat. And they have these little amazing houses that have been built for centuries by the local people called chaumières. And they're composed of these reeds and grasses. And then the more recent work just have thatched roofs. But when I came home, I wanted to refer to those reeds and grasses, which are essentially impenetrable, and they're forbidding, and they look like a marsh version of a cactus. And so I hand stitched them onto the surface of the piece and felt that it then was more representative of that trip. So
Also makes the piece so dynamic.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
Design-wise,
and I wanted to really express the forbidding nature of this vast wetlands. It actually creates its own weather. It creates its own spontaneous fog so that you can't see where you're going and you can get lost. And it's pretty interesting. And hand stitching was the way to go for adding those reeds and grasses, because it was already quilted, pieced, and lined. And so I just hand stitched them onto the surface, and that creates kind of a wiggly surface, which kind of mimics real live grasses. So it all worked out in the end. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Well, here's one for you, Susan. We kind of talked about what you hope the viewer, what feelings and emotions are evoked in a viewer when they see your work. I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And if you feel like you've said kind of as much as you'd like to on that, I'd also like just to know some of the problems you solved when creating this artwork, because it's so complex and you don't get a sense of that unless you really see. I mean, your stitches are hidden. They are a tour de force of a maker's hands. You look at it and you have no idea how you did it. And so beyond even the meaning and the emotional quality, you've got this amazing workmanship. So go with that.
Okay, well, when I started this process 25 years ago, I was on a mission to show that you could create anything sculpturally out of fabric. And that because I was starting to work three-dimensionally, it was a constant challenge. How could you make a person throwing a Frisbee to a dog? How could you, and make that look believable and evocative, right? How could you do that in fabric? How do you make it stand up? What kind of armature do you need? All those questions. So there are many, many physical challenges to making this work.
You're an engineer.
What?
You're an engineer.
Well, I work with engineers often because I don't have all those skills.
You don't? You do? Oh.
I don't. Oh, yeah. I have a whole 10-part motorized circus. The only one piece, the skeleton lady behind me, is part of that. But to get all those pieces to move and make noise, I worked with other makers, primarily my husband, but also a friend of mine who does welding and metalwork for some of the armatures that I need. Just little things like the dresser that's to my, I think it's right of your screen.
Yes.
There's a light in the bottom drawer. If you look at it, there are 3 drawers and mirror on top, and the bottom drawer is slightly. The bottom drawer is slightly ajar, and there's a light inside. And the piece is called Family Secrets. So anyway, my first endeavor with this work was to say, okay, what can I make? How can I make it? And so just the physical challenges of that, and the kind of the joke inherent in making a stack of rocks out of fabric. This is a stack of rocks behind me.
I have one behind me too, of yours.
It's like, how do you make something that's essentially a pillow? How do you take it and make it look believable?
Not like
and
this.
and also sort of like it might be from another planet, because
Mhm.
there's this whole artistic thing going of the artist filters the world, like the colors that you use. The artist filters what we see through their brain, and they give us a different version of the world. So I think that
Mhm.
might be a rock stack that you would find on Venus, right? But it still looks like a rock stack
My
with
kind of planet.
intense coloring that you
Well,
exactly.
how do you
So
do you choose your
go ahead.
fabrics? Do you dye your fabrics or do you purchase your fabrics? I mean,
No,
you
I
get
do
this
no
vivid.
dyeing. Well, I buy other people's hand dyes, and I love using commercial printed patterned fabric. It can't be too rigid. Like I don't use little apples or little zebras on fabric, because that will take away from the shape that I'm trying to convey, the form I'm trying to convey.
Mhm,
But I love combining pattern on pattern. I mean, if you look,
mhm.
there are many fabrics in this rock stack that I've collaged together to make it look like a series of rocks.
Yes.
This figure, this is not a purchased fabric. That's all a collage, which is then cut up and she's
Oh,
stuffed. It's quilted. It's cut up, quilted, assembled, stuffed, reinforced as necessary. Sometimes I have to use a hard armature. Sometimes I use a sort of teddy bear soft armature. But as my point was that when I started this work, it was really just to see if I could do it. And the content has really taken over in the 25
mm,
years. And it wasn't until I started doing this three-dimensional work that I found out that I had something to say, that I could make work that would speak to people and they would laugh. Because I was doing flat quilting beforehand and it was fairly standard for the time. And it wasn't until I started exhibiting the three-dimensional pieces and the figures that there was a real dialogue that happened with the viewer.
that's
So
fascinating.
gradually they become more and more content driven.
Mhm.
And the content drives the technology that I use. So you're going to make a circus, you want the circus to move. And then you have the challenge of how are you going to make the circus move? And who do you know who knows how to make a merry-go-round go up and down and round and make it, the calliope sounds and have the lights, the neon lights fly. How do you do all that? So the technology is kind of, it's driven by the narrative, but it also pulls me through the pieces.
Mhm.
Just figuring out, how would you do that? How do you make a skeleton, right? Well, it turns out there's an armature that's already in the world. And you get on the Halloween website and you buy googly skeletons and you take them apart and you cover them with collage fabric, and there you go.
Yeah, I always think of you, Susan, when Halloween rolls around. So,
And I'm also, and this quality of I've had to start buying anatomical skeletons for lab use, which are way more expensive because the Halloween skeleton quality has declined in the last 10 years.
oh, you would
Anyway,
know.
so
Okay.
let's turn it over to you, because I've talked long enough. Was Lavriere, it's created as kind of as part of a series because so much of your work is about landscape, but can you
Right.
talk about where it fits in that
Sure.
process? Because, and that probably has to do with what you're working on now as well.
Oh, that's a good point. Well, I I have never been a figurative artist. I did study art in college, and I feel like I've been an artist my whole life. At my mother's side, she was an amazing artist. But if I was going to use my subject matter was never the person or figurative, it was the landscape. And once I discovered textiles, that continued. And so my fascination, my inspiration from the landscape could be literally anywhere that I've either seen or been or dreamed about. Mesas, cliffs, glaciers, rivers, forests, swamps, marshlands, just about anywhere. And then as my work has evolved, just like yours has become more about the issues involved with people and families and living situations, etc., mine has been The landscape and and its preservation. I'm worried about the world. I'm worried about a lot of things, but I'm worried about I'm climate change, glaciers melting, and how those are going to cause indelible effects on the world as we know it. So I think that my work in terms of climate change and addressing the environment began with the estuaries and the water and the intertidal zone, those kinds of locations. I think probably because I live in Northern California, I live in Palo Alto, and it's only a 45-minute drive to vast stretches of unincorporated, undeveloped a Pacific Ocean coast. So, and it's all open to the public because of the Free Water Access Act of such and such. But you can go to the coast for free, up and down, and we're talking just the most exquisitely beautiful coast I can imagine. And it hasn't been developed, and that kind of thing I like to celebrate. But then as I became more aware of other situations of glacial melt, etc., my work has evolved into addressing those too. So they're not series in the sense of one and then another and another, where each addresses some problem or some visual interest. It's like more series of addressing those kinds of issues. I guess the closest to one series that I did involved a trip down the Rio Grande in New Mexico, maybe about 8 years ago in the summer. And we were traveling from Santa Fe to El Paso, and I was giving a talk in Mesilla, New Mexico, right next to El Paso, in Las Cruces. And so we'd stayed along the Rio Grande, and that inspired pieces from the desert and from all kinds of amazing landscapes. And then it culminated in a visit to the Bosque del Apache, which is wetlands along the Rio Grande in Socorro, I believe. And it's a tidal flood zone where they allow the water to flood, and it supports vast birds and cranes. And when we were there, it was summer, so it was dry and hot and very deserty. And then we noticed the sky darkening, and within just a few minutes, the sky was black and it was pouring. And I'd never experienced a monsoon before, but it was amazing. And the reeds and grasses at the bosque, the trails are at ground level, so you are walking with the grasses literally towering over your head, and that in itself is an experience. And then when it turns black and it's raining and they're bending and switching and blowing, and then within a series of minutes the storm is gone and the sun is out, and all the water droplets on the reeds and grasses are like diamonds. So that inspired 5, 6, 7 pieces at that time. And so, but they're all completely different, but they were inspired by that trip. So
I would love it if you would talk just for a minute about what you're doing with landscape now, because you have taken your work into a completely different direction, and you're now incorporating your work into the real landscape and making a whole new genre of land art. And I'd love it if you would talk about that just for a minute.
oh, thank you. Well, as I expressed, I'm very familiar with our coast. And during the pandemic, which is now up to almost 2 years ago or more, they closed the coast, and it was a safety precaution. And it made me realize how important the coast, our coast, is to me. And when they reopened the coast, during the early part of the pandemic, I'd been making small sculptural elements. It was kind of like a reaction to being isolated and lucky to have a studio, but I'm isolated within the studio. For some reason, I found solace in hand stitching small works and stuffed, and they all looked like rocks. And so I just, once the beaches opened up, I started taking these little rocks to the beach and to the coast and nestling them into rocks and crevices or next to other rocks on sandy beaches. And over the next few years, like your engineering skills, I started to add bamboo stems to them so that I could secure them into the sand and into the tide pools and have more stability. So now I'm doing these at least once or twice a week. I've done more than 150 installations from here up and down the coast and actually into the woods and into the chaparral. And again, they are to celebrate the beauty of our landscape and to kind of enhance it in some way, just to bring my hand to it.
Well, and also it's hundreds of these little sculptural forms at a time that you're
Yes,
placing in a specific landscape in a palette that is different from the landscape itself. I mean,
that's
looking
true.
behind Judith on the screen, you can see a whole set of them in a vase. And
Yeah,
so imagine those stuck into a meadow or into water that's with the tide going back and forth. It's all documented on Judith's Instagram and on her website. Really, I recommend people go look at it.
Yeah, it's all about context. If these were in the ocean, they read as jellyfish. And if they're in the mountains, a lot of them read as mushrooms. And yes, I have a studio right over there on the other side of the wall. I literally have thousands of these now because I make them and I never leave them there. They're temporary, ephemeral installations full of color and contrast and composition. But after I'm done, I pick them up and I take them home with me to use them again. And so, yeah, I didn't see this coming, but it's just been a lifeline for me. And it's definitely a reaction to the pandemic. Susan, did you have any reaction to the pandemic?
Well, I was already working on the domestic objects series, and so here I was at home, and I live with a bunch of old farm family furniture that's been handed down from my mom's side, and so there I was, right, with all this, these bureaus, and we had a bed from my husband's family for a long time, and you think about people who've rocked in rocking chairs for a long time, so I was kind of surrounded in a way by when we weren't walking.
Right. And you have
out on the beach.
And you have a home studio. You weren't kicked out of your studio, and neither was I.
I was not. No, I have a home studio. I'm very lucky in that way that I could continue to work. And also that I have a group of friends that I was able to continue to see during a pandemic because we were walking on the coast and we met every Friday, a group of about 6 to 8 of us, keeping our 6-foot distance, but we could walk and walk. And it was really, it saved all our sanity. And there are several artists in that group as well. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing that got me, well, when I have a wonderful husband. And so my home village was very supportive. And then luckily I had a social group that I could see not on Zoom. And it was incredibly important.
I'm so glad I didn't have that, but I did have Zoom and I did have you on Zoom.
I know.
Yeah, we're part of a critique group and we're very fortunate. And now we can meet in person again.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's wonderful.
Oh, so let's see. Is there one more? I think there might be one more question. It's about the exhibit.
Yeah. What is your impression of the show?
Well, you and I think were both able to see it, right? You saw it when it came to San Jose?
That's correct.
Yeah, so we've actually seen it in person. The breadth of it is really stunning. And what's really stunning to me is the strength of the early work. That when this movement started in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, those people just kind of came full blown onto the scene and they were inventing a form. And the pieces do not look at all as if they're just sort of messing around, you know, playing with scraps in the studio. How full blown it seemed at the beginning is what really struck me, because the show is organized by decades.
Right.
And
so our pioneers were pioneers of the highest caliber, and they are in this show. Yeah, I began doing art quilts before I had even knew there was such a thing. I was informed that I was doing art quilts, and I'm like, what's that?
No,
but
I'm not.
That said, I couldn't be happier to be part of this tribe and to be part of the Studio Art Quilt Associates. I don't know what I've done without them.
And you've been such a vital part of them.
You too. We were both on the board.
Yes,
and I was a president. I was number 3. Big shoes to follow, but that's okay. No, we are a tribe, and it continues to be an organization that inspires and enriches and provides exhibition opportunities, documentation and education, and even the chance to collect. And
and they have that organization has been really responsive to changes in the art quilting world as they have come along. You know, when I was working 3-dimensionally and nobody else was doing it, the organizations move slowly, but they responded, and all of their shows are now open. Almost all of their shows are open to 3D work. So
the word of the moment is pivot, and we've all had to pivot, haven't we? But they certainly have. Yeah. So, well, maybe this is a good time for our quick fire questions.
Here's our host.
Carrie.
I'm back. Okay, yeah, we'll go ahead and start some of the fun little quick fire questions. So visit a gallery or visit a museum? And we'll start with Judith.
It's equal for me. If I know of a show, I'll have to go see it. And I love gallery shows too. I would love them both. And now that they're more open, I just can put on my mask and I can go, and I'm a happy person.
And Susan?
Well, I tend to like, because I live in a town that does not have a lot of galleries and does not have a lot of museums for that matter. If I get to somewhere in the big city to see, I will usually, my first choice is to go to a museum because there's more that I will be able to access there than in a single gallery. But those gallery days are really fun too, where you walk around a district and you go into this show and that show, and you have a sense of really seeing what's going on in contemporary terms. And it hasn't been filtered so much the way the museum shows have been.
I love the installations of exhibitions. I love the colors that they use on the walls behind the work. I love to see how they install. I'm inspired by just about everything at either a gallery or museum.
Yeah, it's hard to pick between the two. Okay, next question. Morning studio time or morning hike? We'll start with Susan.
It depends on the day. I always have to walk the dog, right? So there's always a morning out the door. I would love to have mornings in the studio, but because of sort of the older you get, the more time you have to spend maintaining the physical plant. So the walks are crucial. And I have 2 scheduled hikes every week, and a couple of scheduled yoga things every week that happen to be in the morning. So I don't get into the studio until about 11, which, you know, it's a sad thing, but it's, and I spend a lot of time at night in the studio.
I garden in the morning. So, and if it's in the summer, it tends to get pretty toasty by the afternoon. So I try to get out there as early as possible, even sometimes at 7. And I like our yard we love to garden, so I have a huge vegetable area. We have microclimates with hydrangeas. We have succulents, and as
Go
a
to her
couch-
Instagram account.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. But my perfect morning, and it's usually about 4 mornings a week, is during the week is gardening or painting walls. I like to paint walls, like the walls behind me, indoors, outdoors. On the weekends, then hiking takes over, because then my husband is with me, though he likes to garden too, but he really loves to hike. And I'm almost always doing an installation. So yes.
Okay. Drawing on paper or drawing digitally? And we'll start with Susan.
I don't draw. The secret of my life is that I grew up in a family of professional artists, and my father, who was a wonderful man and a wonderful artist, taught painting and drawing at our local state college. So after junior high, I never took an art class, and I never drew. My mom was a sculptor. I wasn't going to do that either. You never want to do what your parents do. So I missed out on a lot of sort of technical skills that would have been useful, but also probably would have changed the direction of my work. So it's kind of a toss-up whether, but I don't draw. I cut fabric out, I cut and sew and go and stuff and see if it works. I only draw things out if there's some crucial measurements where I don't want to have to backtrack and do things over. So I feel very unskilled as a two-dimensional artist.
How about you, Judith?
Until we had this conversation, I really didn't realize how similar our work is. They don't look like each other's, but they are so. I don't draw. I can draw, but I don't draw. I like to work in my head. So it's really, I do the dyeing, and that's essentially creating the palette and the composition, the work to use in the composition. Each dye session is informed by the one behind it. So they evolve, and by the end of maybe 7 or 8 dye sessions, I have enough to do a wall piece. But so I'm working in my head. And yeah, it's very intuitive and very spontaneous.
Yeah,
Fun.
I would agree with that.
Yeah,
Drawing is too much like planning.
it is. It's kind of like the step before, especially if you're
We
doing
pay the
sculptural
price
work.
occasionally, but
Yeah.
I
Having
don't know
to
about you.
reverse engineer something that's supposed to either stand upright in the world when it's made of fabric, or have electrical components, and you have to kind of get them in there somehow afterwards when you didn't think about it to begin with. That's when you pay the price for spontaneity.
when I don't have those problems. No
You have
electricity
others.
involved. Thank goodness.
Okay, traditional materials or alternative materials? And we'll start with Judith.
Well, definitely traditional materials, in the sense of I work with silk and dyeing. My process is contemporary interpretation of a traditional process of dyeing. But when you think about it being traditional, something I've learned in doing my installations outdoors is I'm often approached by people, children and adults, wondering what I'm doing, and are these things real, and what are they made of? And I'll tell them they're real, but they're not real mushrooms or real jellyfish. And then I'll say, and they're hand-dyed silk. And I am shocked by how often people say, what's silk? And I go fabric, and it's very strong, and it takes the dye and stuff. So I often see myself as an educator, but so I guess it's traditional material for me. It's not necessarily traditional for the world in general, but yeah, I don't think I use anything too non-traditional, but once I stop this conversation, I look around my studio, I'll probably go, what was I thinking? So anything's fair game. How about you, Susan?
Well, I tend to use a lot of commercially available quilters cotton, and There are some hand dyes that I use that other people have hand dyed for me. It's really what's inside the pieces that's not traditional for me. The surface is it's quilted, mostly almost entirely cotton cloth, collaged together. But the electrical components and the armature materials are certainly not what you'd use in a bed quilt. So the surface is all, I started out as a traditional quilter and still use a lot of those things I learned in the surfaces that I make.
Okay. Okay, and this is the last one, music or podcast? And we'll start with Susan.
Music. I can't, it's hard for me to listen to anything with real intellectual content when I'm trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
There's part of what we do that's very routine, and once you've figured out a piece and it's going in a direction and you need to finish it up, there's a lot of tedious work, and you can listen to something like, I've just never gotten into podcasts, but I find that music is transporting for me, and my brain can be involved with the music at the same time that I'm working. And even if I have to figure something out, I can turn it off if I have to, God forbid, have measurements.
It depends on what I'm doing. My dyeing takes place outdoors. I take hot simmering water onto hot plates under big, huge market umbrellas, and I can do my dyeing any month of the year here in Northern California. So then I'm listening to the birds, and I have a new app called the Merlin app. So I'm discovering we're on kind of like a riparian corridor for Palo Alto standards. And we have a lot of birds. Inside, I've started listening to books on tape that I get from the library. And I have a huge stack of them at all times. And I'm loving that because I'm doing a lot more handwork where I can listen to something else. So sometimes it's music. It used to be the news. And that was just too much. And so I really switched to these books, and it's fascinating, just the things I'm learning. And because I can't read that easily, my eyesight isn't wonderful. And so listening to books is really rewarding.
That's great. Okay, so I guess we'll just go ahead and wrap this artist talk up. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think it was a really great talk. I enjoyed listening. It's always nice to hear the artist intent behind the work, because when you just see it, you kind of have your own opinions and you don't really know what it's about exactly. So I enjoy doing this. Just a reminder, Layered and Stitched is open at the Dairy Barn until September 4th. And for more information, you can check us out at thedairybarn.org.